Sawadee Krap, hello and welcome to another Victor Black podcast. In today's podcast, we're going to be talking with our special guest, Dr. Scott Stevenson, and our subject for today is drugs and supplements that are in common use in our tribe that have the potential, at least, to blunt the hypertrophy mechanism. So what I thought we would do is we would open the discussion up and talk about a half a dozen different let's call them classes or candidates here that we could discuss. The last one I want to talk about a little bit more detail here, and that is the use of antioxidants in our tribe. But I thought it would be a rational thing to do to try and start the discussion with, an overview of a statement that says, look, there are potentially a half a dozen different drugs in common use that have the potential to have a blunting effect here. So I wanted to deal with the easiest ones first, as it were, to address. So before we get into that, let me just, for anyone that doesn't know, I can't imagine a single person watching this doesn't know who Scott is, but maybe Scott, you can just say hello to the audience and briefly introduce yourself and a little bit about your background in terms of your credentials and your practical application is the main for the one person out there that doesn't know who you are.
Well, hopefully there's more than just one, because that means more people are listening to your podcast and following. I am a member of the tribe. Basically, I'm a guy who just fell in love with weight training. I wanted to do it as long as I could remember. And I've just been blessed with a pretty high level of curiosity. So I've been lucky enough, as we were talking about before we started recording, to be able to sort of follow my love and my passion. So that led me down a road of, I went to college, wasn't sure what I wanted to do with my degrees, and decided I'm going to go study exercise. I wanted to become the world's best personal trainer, I say somewhat facetiously. Then I found out I loved to teach, stayed in school, got a PhD. Actually was a college professor for a while. Along the way, I also found I wanted to help people as much as possible, which is what teaching really is. So I became a licensed acupuncturist. I owned a gym for 4 years. Now I've I was helping people probably for a decade, literally for free, dozens sometimes of people with people send me, messages, and I just sort of do informal consults to the degree I could. But coaching for, I don't know how many years, 20 years, maybe, 15 online for sure. Where I was getting paid for it, and doing consultations now. I've written a couple books. I've got my Fortitude training system and my Brain Dump, Be Your Own Bodybuilding Coach, which is really, it's sort of my sort of statement on what the value of a lot of this endeavor can be about, that you can dig in a way that even we talked about, that normal life doesn't, if we're in first world countries, doesn't pose many challenges. And I think there's something in a large part, obviously it's all relative, but bodybuilding is one way to sort of evoke those challenges and give our life greater meaning. I think in a way we seek that out as humans. It's born into us.
Yep. And
being your own bodybuilding coach, despite what some people think, is something you can actually do. You can actually do this whole thing, as I know you did and you've done. You can do it yourself. Yeah. And you learn a lot that way under the pressure cooker of having to make your own decisions when maybe your brain's a little twisted from prep or what have you. So that book is 400 some pages, and it's a combination of 30 plus years of coaching and training and digging into the research.
Can I just add a bolt-on comment to that comment you made there? Because I think that's very important. I always try to relate the story that, in my opinion, this is a discussion about either your money or your time. Anyway, that's what it comes down to. So I truly believe that, for a highly motivated individual person that wants to walk this path themselves, there's tremendous value in literally, doing everything yourself. I fully support that. It's really just, you have to accept, if you're going to do that, then like me, you're going to end up going down a lot of dead ends.
Sure.
I must have spent more time on fruitless endeavors than I did on fruitful endeavors. So when people say to me, why can I not do this myself? You can. I did. I am, for all intents and purposes, self-taught. I am not credentialed. I don't have any credentials of any kind. But I have to admit that I wish I knew what I do now when I was 25 years old.
Oh, I know, right?
it's just you spend a lot of time on things that just don't pan out when you take that path of self-discovery, which is both incredibly valuable, incredibly insightful, and you probably learn more than having spoon-fed during. But if you are a professional with a wife and a kid and a career, and this is a hobby for you, then the likelihood that you're going to be able to spend as many hours a week as you do and I do, down the rabbit hole of the research and the practical application is it just at some point it becomes it's not practical to do both.
Right.
So it's very much your money or your time. Really, you make a decision about which one you're going to put on the table.
Yeah, and I think too, just to sort of unmuddy that a little bit, to some degree, if someone comes to you and let's say they're sort of on the end of the spectrum where they want you to just show them and tell them everything, like take your hand and lead you, that can actually rob you of the experience you may be looking for to some degree. Not for everyone. I mean, I've likened, there's all sorts of ways you can come up with analogies, but it's sort of like you imagine you've just climbed Pikes Peak with a Sherpa. You couldn't have done it on your own, but you had a Sherpa there, a coach who showed you how to navigate. You did the work. You took every step. You dealt with the hypobaria and the treachery of the entire trip. You get to the top and you're like, wow, that's amazing. You have the view, top of Mount Everest or what have you. And some billionaire flies in with his helicopter and lands, and pops open the champagne, and you're like, I don't know. I think I'm getting more out of this experience than he is. And obviously, it's majestic and beautiful, but he didn't do the climb. He didn't follow the path and take the journey. So yeah, so there's something to say.
Agreed. And there's a logical extension of that, of course, then becomes for the genetically gifted. Sometimes they're robbed of the experience as well because things just work during. And if you are less than genetically gifted, I often rely, in my honest opinion, some of the best coaches are people that were okay bodybuilders. They're just okay. They just didn't have the genetics to climb onto the world stage, but they had a tremendous passion and a desire to learn. And so eventually they decided, look, helping others, is probably a more fruitful and productive pathway than, a lot of the very elite people that I've worked with, they miss out on those experiences because they did this and it worked. They got from point A to point B in 3 years, and it took me fucking 30.
Yeah.
So
we learn from the struggle, and if you're looking for someone who can guide you, if you're going to have to struggle, you wouldn't go to that billionaire and say like, hey, what's the best way to get to the top of Pikes Peak? He's like, just hire a helicopter. Well, I don't have $20,000 to hire someone to fly me up. I'm gonna have to walk it. Well, I'm like, okay, well, this is how we would do it then. You need to prepare this way. Here's how we'll train. Blah blah blah. So but there's a fallacy, and this is a huge. I think it's continually operating in the background of almost all of us. And maybe not you and me so much, but even still, you look for clues in the largest individuals, many of whom don't necessarily have clues to share as to how they got there, because they would have gotten there no matter what they did to some degree. The industry, like the athletes that are typically the ones who are, promoting the supplements and the various brands in various ways, aren't ones that represent the people who would be buying those things in hopes that they might help them along their path. And it's a mistake to look at their journey and think that it's necessarily applicable to yours because you didn't have their parents. You're not them. Yeah. And so
for anyone listening, one of the reasons I value Scott's input on discussions like this so much is because he doesn't live in the ivory tower of research and is very practical in his application. This is, I think, one of the great challenges, because as we go through today's conversation, it's going to become relevant that there are some very strong mechanistic discussions you could have as to what mechanistic surrogate studies we can or could look at. But I think most people are really more interested in, how does that translate to me in the real world? It's all well and good to look at a rodent study and say, well, we saw this and, we saw this, these mechanistic pathways or these, potential concerns, as it were. But I want to know what is going to happen to me when I try to take this into the real world and apply it. That's why, as I said, I value Scott's opinion so much, because he doesn't live in the ivory tower of research. He lives amongst us, mere mortals, and helps us to understand, how do we merge these two worlds together? Our understanding of the science and the evidence and the research and real world day-to-day practical hard takeaways. So thank you again for everything you do for the community.
Absolutely.
As far as today's conversation go, let me just jump in and throw a couple of what I think are relatively easy to understand discussions on the table, and we'll move through these fairly quickly because I really want to get to the questions that I have and why I asked Scott to come on. But I think it's important for people to understand that I think today it's fairly easy to make a case to say, look, the use of aromatase inhibitors has the potential to blunt hypertrophy in a statistically significant manner. There are enough studies out there on men using testosterone. I agree that these are individuals using what we would refer to as physiological levels of testosterone, and the overuse of aromatase inhibitors like Arimidex and Aromasin have the potential to have a significant negative effect on both strength gains and protein synthesis, hypertrophic outcomes, right? Do you have anything to add to that, Scott, beyond the fact that this is fairly well understood? It adds just another, feather in the cap, as it were, of why we should be doing everything in our power to avoid using aromatase inhibitors. They, offer very little of value to our tribe beyond the capacity for us to use more testosterone than potentially we should be. And, one of the downsides is, a blunting of hypertrophic effect. Do you have anything you wanted to add to that? Because I see that as a very black and white, straightforward, well understood and easy to communicate discussion. Yourself?
Yeah, I mean, I think the one situation where people might be thinking, well, when would we want to use them might be pre-contest, where someone is driving down body fat to just, extraordinarily low levels, trying to be devoid of body fat. So get rid of the essential fat too. What the hell? We're going to just strip down to nothing. Mm-hmm. That aromatase inhibitors can maybe help there a little bit. But it doesn't mean that it's healthy. It doesn't mean that it's optimal around the year whatsoever. But for a matter of weeks, maybe to get down to a state like that, they can be helpful for people. And I've just seen this with clients too, where it's usually the scenario where I've worked with someone in the past, and this happens a lot actually in various scenarios, and they will take a previous diet or a strategy and literally try to cookie cutter it. Mm-hmm. Where those adjustments were being made on the fly, and then they come in and they've done everything from weeks 12 to 4, or so they think they have. And I'm thinking of a couple different scenarios, and it's like, so are you doing this? And I start going on what about this? You did this? What are you doing to cover your estrogen? It's like, oh, nothing. Like, oh, weren't you taking exemestane before? It's like, yeah, mm-hmm. I ran out at week 10. It's like, that might be why. And once that is added in, you can see that. So that's the main time when you might see this. But as far as hypertrophy, yeah, I'm not going to argue that one.
So the reason I wanted to put this up first, because it kind of sets up the discussion a little bit, whereby I think it's fair to say that, at least in the last decade or so, there was a time, I agree, that, people were not as bullish on testosterone but it's something we, see. Most guys are using testosterone based. It's very rare that you see someone that's not using testosterone based. Most guys would say, you know what, I don't feel like I've blunted my outcomes by using aromatase inhibitors. So this is, the interesting start of that thread is so here's a study in a particular cohort that very, very clearly demonstrates statistically significant blunting. But when you take that discussion into the real world, if you went around and talked to every IFBB professional in the world, I don't think any one of them is going to say I have never used an aromatase inhibitor. Using one has not held me back to a significant degree. And if I took one, it's not the difference between me being, the mass monster or not. So this is the interesting, paradox in these conversations. Here's a discussion about a hypertrophic blunting agent. Very difficult to argue it's not a strong case to make, right? But take it out of the context of this research, take it into the gym, line up the top 100 IFB professionals in the world today, the biggest men in the world, and show me one that hasn't used one. And I don't know that there would be a single person that hasn't used one. So this then starts to pull that thread. Well, okay, it's one thing to say it might blunt hypertrophy, but what does that mean in the real world? Does it mean anything? I'm not sure that we could find someone here that said, look, buddy, if you didn't use an aromatase inhibitor, you'd be on the Olympia stage today. Your thoughts?
Yeah, so there's the devil's in the dose, as they say, and there's probably, if we just think of, let's just take estradiol and testosterone, and consider someone who's, maybe they're using a gram of testosterone. So their estrogen levels could be fairly high, depending on the extent to which they aromatize that testosterone. Then you have to ask the question, well, do I want to get gyno? Probably not. Do I want to control that? The water retention can be, and blood pressure could be an issue potentially for someone. And what amount of estrogen is going to give me the maximal impact of the estrogen in of itself, in the context of someone whose, testosterone levels are tenfold eugonadal levels. And that's what we don't know. And there's probably some variability there as well. The degree to which someone might have gyno-like issues, that varies tremendously, right? So some people may be like, you know what, I really don't care. I'll lose the 20 or 30% of muscle mass that I might gain, not to have to go and get gyno surgery, which would be a nice solution if that's the only issue. But they may have other issues that are related to that. So there's so many interactions there, and there's so much biological interindividuality as far as the extent to which estrogen might be anabolic for that individual in the context of all the other things they're doing, which is probably on a rotation of some sort, that it is very hard to tease out, like I think you were saying, the individual impact of using an aromatase inhibitor, and depends on which one you're using. It's interesting that there's a dose response for those as well. I think probably that changes to the extent to which your liver can metabolize those drugs is going to change their pharmacokinetics, and the pharmacodynamics would stay the same potentially, unless there's metabolites that maintain. I think it's Novodex has some metabolites that could stay around for months and months and months. So not that that's an AI, but that's an example of a drug that just, obviously, things like DECA and that sort of thing can remain in the system for months or years. So there's all sorts of variables there that could come into play that could make it very difficult to compare John and George, who have very different metabolisms of testosterone and aromatization of testosterone, and then metabolism of the different AIs that they may have tried in the context of a black market, or taking, research chemicals, which may or may not be under overdosed, or maybe they just put, Arimidex and everything, and they call it letrozole, they call it exemestane, or what have you. So yeah, it's tough in sort of an uncontrolled real world experiment like that to figure out what exactly is going on,
where the line is.
And also too, like, one of the things that I've seen this in the context of like people using like the growth hormone secretagogues, for instance, where you can get so much water retention. If you took someone who just said, you know what, I just don't get gyno, or maybe I had it removed, I'm not going to get gyno, and they just use no AI, and they just blast. They go for broke, and they're water soaked, and because of the cell swelling that comes along with that, it may be very anabolic just because of that reason, to some degree. But they can't tell how much they're gaining if they were to go on an AI and they were to pull their diet back and have maybe a mini cut of some sort. They might drop 15 or 20 pounds of water. Some people just simply wouldn't want to be able to do that, because you can't tell how much you're actually gaining when it comes down to comparing hydration status at the beginning of a bulk and the hydration status at the end, because it's changed so much. So that's another kind of confounding factor. It's like, what's actually going on in my body composition here? Am I gaining water weight? I mean, gosh, 10 pounds of water weight in someone who's relatively lean can look really, really good. If you're not that lean, 10 pounds of water weight just means you look sloppy and sloppier, and neither one of those is a good look.
Agreed.
And and people aren't going to want to go for that too. So it's hard to find people. I have seen the best example, I think, of people who might have that kind of go for broke perspective are power lifters who have tried to put on as much size as they can, and maybe even gone into bodybuilding afterwards. Again, not a controlled, randomly selected population there, but those guys who just pack it on and push and aren't really concerned about looking pretty for the beach every year necessarily. They just want to be as strong and big as possible and want muscle mass because that's going to help with the strength. Will sometimes be the guys who were bloated and big and maybe and not worrying about taking a bunch of AIs. They may not even know if they're getting some gyno because they've got so much body fat accumulating. And they tend to gain muscle and strength really, really well. So that's just sort of one, if you kind of piled up your data in the different piles or your information, like what's the evidence that not having an AI or not controlling estrogen in the way that, a bodybuilder who's got to look good for Instagram, has got to do photo shoots, et cetera, might. Those powerlifters at one end of the spectrum who might diet down, those tend to be guys who put on a lot of size, and they're just letting all the estrogen accumulate that might be there without too much worry about it. So, yeah, it's hard to say. You're right. Not as much direct evidence there because you can megadose vitamins, antioxidants, which we'll talk about. I think you can megadose non-steroidal anti-inflammatories. Those things, have been tested. Maybe we'll get into that data eventually, but you're not going to get a human subjects committee to agree. Like, okay, let's see what happens if we put, we'll have a control group and we'll have two groups on 1,000 grams of testosterone, one with and one without an AI, and see what this does. You can maybe do an animal model of that sort, but that's a less appealing experimental design because those answers, they don't apply to anyone but you and me and the people who are listening here necessarily. And there's not money in that per se. Whereas lots of people, you can go out, you can go to the pharmacy and buy 1,000 milligrams of vitamin C, 400 IUs of vitamin E. Those are mega doses. 1,000 milligrams of vitamin C is equivalent to like 20 oranges in terms of vitamin C, I think, something like that. It's a lot. And, Linus Pauling, is probably the person who put that into our mindset as much as anyone. And there can be things, that can be useful, for instance, cancer treatment, those sorts of things. But that's a thing that is prevalent in society, so that you can get money to do research and look into those things. Whereas it's not as clear with something like anabolic steroids.
That was put on research money on the table for this. That's good. All right, so we'll just move on. I'm just going to push through a couple of slides here because I put these up on the premise that you might want to drill further into those, but let's move on. So the second one is, anyone that's heard me talk has, heard me rattling on at some point, I imagine, about the fact that, in my opinion at least, if you're going to be using supraphysiological levels of androgens, that you should be using an ARB by default. Now, the reason I'm very bullish on this is because you can trace a great many of the problems that we experience as enhanced trainers, from cardiac remodeling to kidney problems to elevated blood pressure to hematocrit levels, all the way back directly to the doorstep of angiotensin II. Okay. Now, here's a study that shows that if you were to take an angiotensin II blocker, that you're going to inhibit 96% of hypertrophy in a rat model. So again, the challenge is that if you look at this from a real world perspective, we can talk about the problems of cardiac remodeling in our tribe, the occurrence of left ventricular hypertrophy, a known consequence of androgen use. We can talk about the impact of angiotensin II on renal problems. It's not a very difficult argument to make to say, look, if you can suppress angiotensin II, this is a good thing for our tribe. Anabolic steroids increase angiotensin II. That's not a good thing. That's something we should suppress. And I would argue that, in anyone that is, at the very least, if you're experiencing elevated blood pressure, you should be using an ACE inhibitor, an ARB blocker. But again, you pull out this rat model and it will tell you that will destroy your gains. I will be very honest with you. I would say that, a great many people who use anabolic steroids have blood pressure problems consequential to angiotensin 2, and a great many of them use blood pressure medications. And I don't know a goddamn one of them that I'm going to pull aside and like say, well, if he didn't use that blood pressure medication, he would be on the Olympus stage today. It's held him back. It's destroyed 96% of his gains. I would actually go one step further and say, if that was myself, and if someone was able to demonstrate in our tribe that maybe these compounds blunt a few percent, if they knocked you down a few percent, it would be worth every percent you hit because of the benefits they bring to the table. Do you know what I mean? So this is a classic example to me of, even if we saw blunting here, given the payback, given the return that's on offer through offsetting cardiac remodeling, left ventricular hypertrophy, kidney disease, elevated blood pressure, elevated hematocrit, I would pay that toll every single day of the week to be void of those problems. I don't care. I'll pay that price. Your opinion on this subject?
This is the time when I think this is something that I don't think that I've heard you say in what you've mentioned so far, and I see this missed continuously, and it's the model of that I think actually I'm not going to tell you anything you don't know here, but it's something that I think applies to this topic just in general and applies to exercise adaptation very globally, is that this is a hormetic stimulus, meaning it's an inverted U. And I think, see if I can figure out which plot. There's one that I sent you a graph. Let's see. There's an author there. It's the fourth one I sent. It's green, red and green. This is figure 2.
It's red and green?
Yes.
Yep. Okay, cool. Let me
if that one can, yeah, and it shows it's for antioxidant supplementation.
Yep. Let me just grab that. Hang on a sec. Yeah.
Or you can, or the first. Actually, you can put up the if you want, put up the first one that I sent you. That
this one?
Optimizing training stimulus hormesis. Then we can go to the second one.
There we go. Okay.
Yes, there you go. So this is the idea. This comes from what talk that I've given. Actually, I think I have this in several talks because it's so globally useful to understand things in this way, is that the dose of exercise stimulus that we provide is going to at some point be sort of an optimal one as you go from 1 set to 3 sets to 5 sets. This is one reason why people say, volume is the quote driver of muscle hypertrophy. I'm like, I don't agree with that statement in the way it's used many times. But at some point for a given individual, you're going to have sort of an optimal stimulus to produce maximal adaptation, all other things being equal. And you go beyond that, then you're doing too much, and eventually you'll be where you're not making any gains. And if you keep trying to push beyond that, you'll be literally in an overtraining scenario. So someone who has really good genetics, I think this is one of the things that you typically will see in people who are just genetically gifted to become pros relatively rapidly, is they have the ability to handle a higher training load, train harder, and recover better, so they can provide a stronger stimulus. So they would be that green excellent recovery plot. They're getting a better adaptation, and they can handle a higher training dose. Someone with poor recovery, and that could be just because of their genetics, because of their sleep, because of what have you, is going to be that red dot, or the red line, sorry, and they're just not going to do as well. So that's that. The x-axis there, that horizontal axis is sort of the dose, the stimulus, the disruption to homeostasis that's brought about by the training, which triggers the adaptation of muscle growth. And there are various aspects of that. And that's what I think is going on here with the estrogen, to some degree, being a devil in the dose, and angiotensin 2 or angiotensin. I think more so specifically, this fits with the idea of non-steroidal anti-inflammatories, antioxidants. You had another one there on the list there that you showed at the beginning.
Yeah, I'll just run up to the top of the list. So the 5 subjects I was going to hopefully touch on were estrogen suppression, angiotensin 2, metformin, berberine, antioxidants. Yep. So
3 and 5 specifically, and when we can connect it also to metformin, and all of them really to some degree. So if we go now to that, go back to the
red and green one. Yeah,
that's the one.
Yep.
So that's you can see there's a similar a similar scenario. We have level reaction or active oxygen species. You can basically substitute that for the training stimulus, because one of the things that training does is produce a superoxide radical. Literally, it happens in mitochondrial oxidative phosphorylation, which just make free radicals as part of the exercise stress. It's like 3%, something like that, of the oxygen going through the mitochondria does that. And you produce free radical stress. If you blunt that with vitamin C and vitamin E, for instance, that combination was used early on and they've used it since then, you will see a reduction in the free radical stress. If you're someone who, for instance, did so much that you're on the far end of that plot where it's green there, and you reduce the level of reactive oxygen species by using some amount of antioxidant, some vitamin C and vitamin E combination, let's say, or acetyl-L-cysteine, whatever it might be, you could actually reduce the stress so that you move from right to left where it's green, and you have an enhancing effect on the adaptation that comes about. This is plot it doesn't quite show exactly. It's just another example of hormetic relationship between stress and function or adaptation in our case. So now if you keep on blunting, and you like I said, vitamin C, 1,000 milligrams is like 20 oranges. Like, no one's going to eat 20 oranges. That's beyond what our bodies are sort of engineered for. Most animals actually make vitamin C on their own, but humans don't. There's an interesting story behind that. But so if you completely blunt that free radical stress, especially when it comes to aerobic adaptations, a lot of the work has been done there. We see that you can blunt pretty strongly things like increased insulin sensitivity. You'll blunt the increase in mitochondrial biogenesis. You can basically ablate it, remove it, because you remove that stimulus. So if you, with the right amount of blocking in a situation where you're doing way too much for an optimal adaptation, you can actually enhance your adaptation by reducing that stress to some degree with an antioxidant, let's say. This applies for non-steroidal anti-inflammatories as well. Metformin, we can get into, just a little bit different. So the big overarching point here is that the devil is in the dose, and it's also in the context.
Agreed.
So
it's also I think it's also fair to say it's in the dose of the treatment, but it's also in the dose of the underlying stress that you begin the discussion with. Correct.
That's what I mean by context, right?
Yeah. This is my point. If we look at drugs like boldenone, right, which is, I'm not a fan of boldenone. I'll just quickly explain my personal hypothesis about how boldenone is so destructive on it's kidney and liver toxic. This is well understood in animal models, but no one has been able to explain to me why. And I propose that the reason behind it is, if you look at boldenone and you go, well, what is it infamous for? It's infamous for elevation of hematocrit levels. This is what it seems to do to a greater degree in a dose-dependent capacity than any other anabolic steroid we have. It seems to raise hematocrit, right? So through what mechanism? Well, through the mechanism of angiotensin II. That's the mechanism through which it raises hematocrit levels, and also through the elevation of angiotensin II, it creates greater degrees of oxidative stress compared to other steroids like Winstrol, and when they've been tested in rodent studies. So again, the concept is saying, well, the drug that you take, the dose that you take, takes a certain amount of stress that then you need to manage. And depending on what your starting point of the stress is, depending on then that just logically follows what your actions are with the follow-on action, determine whether it could be potentially beneficial or harmful to your progress. In the circumstances where you're taking a drug like boldenone, where it's creating liver toxicity and kidney toxicity, removing that toxicity, just the act of removing that toxicity through angiotensin II suppression has the potential to allow you to move forward with your progress, because you're mitigating the stress on the renal system and on the liver system. So this is, I guess, my whole point in these things. It's such a complicated conversation that I just don't think it's practical to make for where people make statements like, such and such blunt hypertrophy. And I give it a couple of examples. I shit you not, I have heard people say, like, I don't want to take a blood pressure medication because it's going to blunt my gains, but I have elevated blood pressure. I go, dude, you're freaking mad. Like, so you're prepared to create that stress on the circulatory system, on the kidney system, for the extra 2 pounds of tissue that you may or may not gain, consequential to managing, hypertension. It's not like it's a switch. I guess that's the main point I wanted to make in this conversation from my point of view, is it's not a switch. I've never had a client that I've given an antioxidant to, or I've given an ARB to, or I've given metformin to, that suddenly just stops growing consequential to that. You could sit down and make an argument that, over the course of 10 years, that individual might have seen a better outcome should he not have taken that path, right? But that's an extremely convoluted and complicated conversation that's dependent on so many variables that it's almost difficult to plot it out and have it in a logical sense. It's not like saying, okay, so we know if we give, 1 milligram of Arimidex to men who are taking TRT a day, their body composition, markers and their strength will be blunted. Do you know what I mean? It's just a really complicated conversation, in my opinion, to have.
For some it may, and for some it might not. That's why seeing the individual data points, or at least looking at the means and the distribution, the standard error, standard deviation, can be very, very telling. So let's just as up. Here's a kind of a practical real world example it's not even necessarily drug related. So imagine you've got a scenario where someone is on the right side of that hormetic curve in terms of the training that they do and the free radical stress that they produce. They kind of tend to overdo it, like maybe a few bodybuilders are known to do. I think I've maybe done that a little bit in the past. And you take scenario one, where they've got lots of reactive oxygen species. They've got high free radical stress, and they start eating more fruits and vegetables. They just add them in, like some veggies and fruits alternating in their meals, and they have an enhancing effect on their adaptation because they get healthier. They now have limited that free radical stress and brought it closer to that optimal level for producing the best adaptation that they can. So that's scenario one. Very practical, like let's just try to get those antioxidants through fruits and vegetables the way sort of Mother Nature intended, you might say. And like, oh, well, no, let's take take scenario two, and no, we're going to just take the antioxidants galore, and we're going to take we're going to take 2 different liver protectors with silymarin and acetylcysteine and alpha lipoic acid, and we're going to take a gram of vitamin C because we're going to blunt the cortisol on top of that with it, and vitamin E, and you basically blunt antioxidant, or you blunt free radicals to such extent that you end up on the far left of that plot. So now you've got free radical oxygen species and free radical stress minimized to the extent you possibly can, and now you've blunted the adaptation. In one scenario, you've used antioxidants and you've gotten a better adaptation. In the second scenario, you've used more antioxidants and you've got a worse scenario, the first situation. So that's the nuance of this that I think people miss, is that balance is going to be different for everyone depending on what their constitution is, what their innate free radical quenching abilities are, which actually changes as we get more trained. For instance, that's a standard training adaptation, actually, is to upregulate the enzyme levels of the free radical quenching enzymes, superoxide dismutase, glutathione peroxidase, et cetera, catalase, et cetera, et cetera. That happens. Same thing happens with drugs, of course. You get upregulation in the P450 enzymes that we can talk about. Those are the ones that actually are involved with producing free radicals. But you get better at metabolizing those drugs to some degree. Ideally, with the idea that you can limit that free radical stress, because the other enzymes in the liver that are involved with removing those free radical producing compounds to clear them from the system also would go up too, in an ideal situation, unless you're using too much, in which case you can end up being less healthy and have an inability to quench the free radicals brought on by the drugs that you're taking, and end up with a situation where you spiral down. Oh God, I feel sick. My appetite's gone down for my orals. I'll take more free radical quenching antioxidants. I'll take more liver support, which then means you're unhealthy and you're also quenching free radicals, squashing them with the mega doses of vitamin C and E and the liver support supplements. And now you've reduced your stimulus for growth, because you need to have some free radical stress. And now you're in a situation where you shot yourself in both feet with the drug use, and then what you're trying to counteract with the drug use. With the free
So
radical
let me just go back to, this is really the image that you were talking about. I've just drawn this from it's the same
I was happy to see that.
Yeah. So let me just ask a couple of what might seem like really obvious questions. I just want to make sure that you have the same understanding. So it's my understanding that there's very, very limited evidence today to say, look, in athletes, that the use of antioxidants in terms of improving recovery and that sort of stuff have any significant benefit, principally because it doesn't appear that the amount of ROS stress and oxidative stress that we create is of a great enough magnitude for benefit. And so the recommendation is it's not a strong recommendation for the heavy use of antioxidants in the athletic community, let alone the citizen Joe. Yeah. The blunt question that I have is, I believe, and this is why I'm interested whether you've ever seen any evidence to support this or to refute this, is that in our tribe, because of our behaviors, that we expose ourselves to greater levels of stress than that community. As I said, just the act of, many of these drugs cause oxidative stress in and of themselves. If you did nothing but sat on the couch and injected the drugs, you would see an increase in oxidative stress consequential to the administration of the drugs themselves. So the question in my back of my mind is the obvious one that says, right, so if we take, natural athletes and say, look, there's very limited evidence to say that the use of antioxidants is going to provide significant benefit here, because we simply don't see the degree of stress whereby they would be beneficial. But there is a hypothetical turning point where you cross that line and you say, look, it's for anyone, kind of watching, it's this zone here, where as the increasing levels of stress exposure over time cross a threshold, then there is a discussion that this may well be beneficial. My eternal question is it plausible that we lay on the other side of that fruits and vegetables, a diet rich in fruits and vegetables, is simply not enough, that we should be using antioxidants? We are a unique, cohort. We are different from that tribe because we're creating greater stress. But underlying that discussion is, it's in my experience that, most of us don't eat diets rich in fruits and vegetables to begin with. So I push guys to say, look, you need to eat a diet rich in fruits and vegetables, so that's the foundation position for your management of oxidative stress through food on your plate, right? And then you could even make an argument that says, well, we need to have more on top of that. My argument is this: you have a group of individuals that, in my opinion, are creating higher stress levels than almost any other cohort that I can imagine. How are they creating more stress? And they have very poor diets in the scheme of things. Chicken and broccoli and rice. It's almost like, well, hang on a sec. That might be true for that group over there, but for this group of people, they better be paying attention to antioxidant supplementation, or they got to fix their diet. Make a decision. My preference would be fix your diet. Right. But if I can't convince these guys to eat a diet rich in fruits and vegetables, and in my experience, very often I can't, because it's cultural, it's instinctive. Right. The only option left is you say, well, look, now we have to start cracking jars of these things open and using these supplements, right? Because you won't behave the way that you should be behaving. So, my standardized diet model, I say, if you're going to eat 5 meals a day, you should have 5 protein sources, 5 carbohydrate sources, and 20 different fruits and vegetables on your plate. Most people, when I say that, look at me like a deer in the headlights. Oh my God, how could you possibly do that? But I do it for a reason, and that's because I'm trying to manage the stress that I'm creating through my behavioral choices through food.
Right.
So I guess that's a long, but it's leading to this question. So if we have a group of people that won't do that, if we have a group of people that won't adopt that behavior, a diet rich in fruits and vegetables, if we have a group of people that are creating far greater stress levels than natural athletes, surely we have to be making recommendations. Well, it's antioxidant time, boys.
Mm-hmm.
This is my argument with this, or
right.
my thought pattern. I wanted to understand your position here.
So yeah, the devil's in the dose. I'll come right back to that. Is that if you are on that right side of this hormetic curve where your adaptation is not optimal because you've got too much free radical stress, you're eating no fruits and vegetables, you're training like a banshee, you're probably sore a lot of the time. This is something I've learned. People who followed me for the last few years have noticed that I've become very much attuned to this. Is then you want to move yourself to that point of optimal adaptation. Most over-the-counter, like I said, 1,000 milligram vitamin C tablets are easy to come by. That is going to just blunt your free radical stress substantially. That's way too much. That's using a jackhammer to kill a gnat. You punch a hole in the wall, it defeats the purpose. So this is where, for instance, and of course, you're not going to be able to, unless someone's, Elon Musk, they're not going to be able to make the biochemical measurements in order to see what's actually going on if they increase supplement use in order to try to mimic what you might get from regular fruits and vegetables. That's the obvious one, because nature's already kind of engineered the path for us to some degree. It's like it's in the foods there for the most part, unless you're like seeking out like some exotic distilled extract of amla or something like that. It's loaded with antioxidants. You're not going to run into situations very easily if you're eating from what Mother Nature provides, where you're going to just completely blunt and block free radical stress. So the first thing is to ask sort of how much, and a lot of over-the-counter stuff is not going to do the job. This is where at least a good place to start would be like a greens formula or a fruit and greens formula that's derived from fruits and vegetables of known amounts, with known amounts of ORAC, of antioxidant quenching abilities, that has been, it's standardized, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. You've got something that is there that matches what a given amount of fruits to vegetable intake would be. There's an example I want to pull out, because it's from the non-steroidal anti-inflammatory literature that's pretty interesting. So we know that NSAIDs, they block the COX enzymes, depending on which one you're talking about, and that limits protein synthesis. That can slow down satellite cell activation, proliferation, and it can blunt muscle growth too in the long haul. There's a study actually was done at Ball State in older folks, and older people tend to be more susceptible to inflammation after resistance exercise. They tend to have greater DOMs, and they don't do quite as well with the repeated bout effect. There's something about the aging process that limits our ability to recover. And when they gave non-steroidal anti-inflammatories to the older folks, the group that got the NSAIDs actually grew better than the other groups. So you know about this study. My thought is that because they had greater free radical stress, the aging effect pushed them to the right of that hormetic curve, and the NSAIDs brought them back closer to optimal, so they got better muscle growth over time. That would be what you'd want. So from a practical, like in the trenches perspective, if someone could even do this. They could even, go and say, okay, here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to take, there's one of the studies that I sent you of some figures, or at least one figure from, I think 500 milligrams of vitamin C and like 150 or 200 IUs of vitamin E before and after resistance training. And so that's a pretty hefty amount. And that actually blunted growth. I believe it's a study with older folks. I think that's the one.
Is that the Paulson study?
Yeah.
2014? Yeah. Okay. Hang on a second. Let me just pull that up. So, there we go. That's the one there?
Yes.
Yeah.
I believe so. So anyway, we don't need to go into the details now. So I'm trying to make just a kind of a basic point here is someone could go, if they wanted to test this out, give themselves what they know to be a megadose and see what that does to soreness after this, you know, when they're in your standardized training regime. I get sore really easily. There's actually a number of genetic polymorphisms that are sort of connected with muscle injury and the late onset muscle soreness. So some people get sore and they stay sore and they don't have much repeated about. This is all over the place. And I did a decent amount of research in this area when I was in grad school. So I got to see like literally dozens, probably actually hundreds of subjects that I was involved with, like personally testing and getting their soreness ratings on. And I got a funny story I've shared on another podcast I can share here with you here, but it's pretty cool. So one of the things someone could do then is give themselves a megadose and see what that does. Like, you know what? It seems like free radical stress for me is an important part of what's going on in terms of soreness, in terms of the injury that I experience, the inflammation that I experience, et cetera, et cetera. I don't want to completely blunt that. But if I'm training in a way that every time I come back and train X muscle group, every time on my push days, let's say in my push-pull legs routine, I'm still sore to the touch when I stretch. You can even make those measurements, just write them down in your logbook if you keep one. That's not where you want to be. You might want to be where you come back and like maybe there's just the slightest amount of soreness every time you come back to train that muscle group. That might be what you get when you add in a greens formula or you start eating the way your Coach Black says you should eat in terms of fruits and vegetables and notice that difference. So you could like literally say, get sort of a baseline. What happens if I just blunt the free radical stress altogether in terms of what I can subjectively measure, soreness the day after, 2 days after, and soreness when I come back in, and then see if I can temper that in a way that sort of, from just a common sense perspective, makes sense. I don't want to be blastingly sore for 5 or 6 days. Even if I'm training once a week, you'd want to have some days, probably 2 or 3 maybe on that kind of a regime where you're not just incredibly sore where you wouldn't want to train that muscle again. So you can temper that and see what happens. There are those days, and I know you know this one, those days you go in and you can still battle out a good workout. You have to maybe do an extra couple warm-up sets or some extra reps, some extra stretching, warming up in some other way, and you can push through workout and maybe eke out some process in your logbook or, you know, get a couple extra reps on some of your big sets. And then there's those days you walk in and you go to put the first 45 or 20 kilo plate on the bar and you're like, this feels like a tiddlywink. Like this is going to be a good day. Everything feels light. Your warm-up sets, the weight's just moving almost like gravity has been altered, like time and space is like a little warp around you and you're not sore. That's ideally how you would feel, like highly recovered. I use the perceived recovery scale. It's in my book. It's actually on my site. People can like download it, go to the Be Your Own Bodybuilding Coach resources on my website, drscottstevenson.com. And you can download that. And that's something that's just a whole body general recovery status, but you can apply that to a muscle as well if you want and come up with your own subjective rating. So temper those things and see like what's going on when you do change your intake of things like, for instance, curcumin has COX inhibitory and lipo-oxygenase inhibitory actions. You know, people worry about resveratrol as well. That's, you know, free radical quench. You can load up on that. I know of a guy who bought like bushels of that once they thought he was going to like go big. He thought he was going to make millions. And I think it's probably just rotting in a warehouse somewhere, you know.
Let me just throw a couple of others out there in that, because guys are interested. So this is where you'll often hear things like, well, such and such blunts mTORC, like, oh my God, you can't blunt mTORC. Like, but few people know that caffeine blunts mTORC, curcumin, as you said, green tea extracts, you know, all of these compounds, as you said, have a blunting effect attached to them. The magnitude of the impact is what's important, not the premise.
Resistance exercise blunts mTOR during the exercise.
During the exercise itself. So I guess my point for people listening is it's more complicated than you hear the words blunting and mTOR. Right? You have to ask more questions. The context matters here, and that's where I often hear people talking about, like, you know, non-steroidal inflammatories, blunt hypertrophy, you know, AIs, blunt hypertrophy, you know, ARBs, blunt hypertrophy, you know, overuse of antioxidants, blunt hypertrophy. Hell, I've heard people say I'm not eating vegetables because they blunt hypertrophy. We're not supposed to be using antioxidants. Like, okay, fair enough, but it's
and just think back to that green and red plot with the hormetic curve. It's like,
yep.
they shift the stimulus to the left, which could be good or bad, depending on you.
Yep, agreed. Who you are, the context of who you are matters, and your behaviors matter.
Absolutely.
Yeah, cool. Okay, I want to spend a little time talking about Metformin and Berberine, because these are two compounds that just seem to be hot topics at the moment with regard to the blunting of hypertrophy. So just allow me a little latitude. Let me introduce this study that was actually released a little while ago. It's certainly not new, and then I'll get you to give some input. This was a study that was done for the date. I think it was 2017 it was started, but I think it was published 2019. And it looks at the effect of metformin and strength training in seniors. And by seniors, we mean men and women over 65 years of age. They were using 1,700 milligrams of metformin a day, 70 grams of protein intake a day. I just want to run through the explanation of why I believe this happened, and then get you to refute that, agree with that, pull that apart, whatever you want to do with Scott. Because I heard you talking relatively recently on a podcast about this particular subject. So just indulge me for a moment. Let me just explain what I normally explain to people about this particular study, and then I'll get you to kind of jump in. So I think it's probably fair to say that, yes, it's absolutely true that in individuals using this compound at those dosages, men and women, 70 grams of protein, some individuals saw a blunting of hypertrophic response. It's a great irony, of course, and this is a very, very small point, but I think it's important to make it. The person with the greatest response by a very small margin was in the metformin group, right? Mm-hmm. So it doesn't mean that every individual is going to have a horrible response. Of all the individuals, the person that got the greatest response was actually using metformin. But it's fair to say there was a number of graphics in this study that there was a downward shift in terms of increase in muscle thigh area for these individuals. Now, what it doesn't point out here is that there were men and there were women in this group, and we don't know whether that had any impact at all. And the reason I say that is that we have reasonably good information to say, look, if you use metformin, whether you're a man or whether you're a woman, you are going to see a decrease in testosterone levels and a decrease in insulin levels. In this group of women, given 1,500 milligrams a day, their insulin levels decreased by 25%, their testosterone levels by 23%. And I think it's probably fair to say that if you took a 65-year-old woman and decreased her testosterone by 23% and her insulin levels by 25%, and all of the growth factors associated with that, I think that you should expect to see blunting of hypertrophic response. Any drug that blunted insulin-related growth factors and testosterone by 25% should expect to see hypertrophic blunting. Now, the question then is, everyone's saying, well, through what mechanisms? And all of the studies that I've seen so far have suggested it's through blunting of basically blunting of mTORC through the AMP pathway. I've spoken about this before. There are a number of AMPK subunits. Not all of them are activated by metformin, and the one that is activated by metformin basically is not the one that's responsible for muscle atrophy in a typical sense. So this study basically shows that AMPK1 and AMPK2 basically have consequence of effect, but it's not a simple case of elevate AMPK, down-regulate mTORC. It's a little bit more complicated than that. I think you put it out very elegantly in your podcast that it's also true that metformin has been shown to have a direct impact on mTORC, but that seems to be dose dependent as well. But my main point I wanted to get across to people here was this: if you took a group of 65-year-old plus people and gave them 70 grams of protein a day, and gave them a product that is, potentially an antioxidant, as metformin is known to be, right? Mm-hmm. Has anti-inflammatory, antioxidant properties, and you gave them 1,700 milligrams a day, enough to see an effect of, 25% plus percent of testosterone reduction, 25%-ish reductions of insulin levels, and of course the growth factors consequential to that. Would we be shocked to see a blunting of hypertrophic effect? And I would say, I don't think anyone should be shocked by that at all. The question then becomes, if you took a 30-year-old man who's taking 1,000 milligrams of testosterone and 10 units of growth hormone and 50 units of insulin a day, and as guys are wont to say, is 500 milligrams of metformin a day going to stop them growing? And my argument is, I don't know that you could actually blunt hypertrophy under those circumstances. I don't think it's possible to blunt it, Julian. I think it's quite a stretch to say a study like this shows that metformin blunts hypertrophy to the degree that our tribe need to be concerned about its use. Julian?
Right.
I think that it's what this demonstrates is what it demonstrates what it demonstrates. You're in that particular cohort, it's an issue to be considered. Julian?
Mm-hmm.
So then when you move to people using HRT, is that the same discussion? Plausibly not, because we don't deal with the testosterone issue. And then you move to people that are using, growth hormone and insulin and IGF-1. I just think I really just think it's like a non-issue. More importantly, what I want to basically talk about is, do the benefits of using an insulin sensitizer, regardless of which one it is, outweigh that small blunting effect? And that's a discussion anyone could argue, for or against. I don't have a problem with that. But simply from my point of view, guys see these studies that show what they show, and then carry them over to our corner and shine a light at them and say, here's proof that metformin is something that we should not be using. And right. I wanted to get your feedback and your takeaway through any and all of that, please.
Yeah, so there's a spectrum. Like literally, you've got the 25, 30-year-old who's geared up on a gram of test and 10 IUs of GH and 50 IUs of insulin, and who's pushing the limits, and they're eating 5,000 calories a day, and 500 IUs of metformin is, not something necessarily to worry about, especially if they find, for instance, that brings their HbA1c down and their resting glucose levels come down into the normal range. It's probably a good thing for them, I would think. And then you move down, you may have an individual then or situation where someone's 40, 45, and they're using 100 milligrams of testosterone a week, and they've had trouble putting on or holding muscle mass, and they're maybe eating a little bit below the caloric balance point, so there's a little bit of deficiency, and they're trying to use 1,000 or 1,500 milligrams of metformin, and they're for someone who is at one end of the genetic spectrum for gaining or holding muscle mass, there could be a negative impact with them. And they can figure that out simply by taking it out and adding it back in.
Stop using it.
See what happens, Yep. So there's going to be from at one end, it's a drop in the pond. It doesn't make a damn bit of difference. And then when you move down towards HRT in certain individuals, there'll be some people won't matter whatsoever. In others, it could have somewhat of a significant difference for them. I've always likened this. See, the thing about especially metformin, it's an exercise mimetic in a sense, because it turns on AMPK. It activates the energy sensor that gets activated when we start to exercise, and you have a depression phosphorylation state. Energy, the sensing mechanism for energy demand is AMPK. That's the sort of the main energy sensor in the muscle. Yep. So that basically says, okay, it's time to start oxidative phosphorylation. It's time to make ATP. It's time to fuel the exercise. It's time to be catabolic, break down fuel, bring in glucose, help with glucose and insulin. Insulin's job of bringing glucose in, insulin sensitivity would go up. Use glycogen. Some people get flat when they take metformin. They notice that. They just don't fill out very well when they're trying to carb up or just over the course of a diet. And let's turn off anabolism as you do during exercise. You're not trying to build protein in the middle of your set of squats to failure. You're doing everything you can to be catabolic and make ATP. Yep. So that's what metformin is doing to some degree. And it's a little bit like someone who is trying to do cardio when they're trying to gain muscle mass. Some people, especially when they're dieting down, of course, are trying to hold muscle mass in this case. They do cardio and their legs just wither.
Yep.
You literally got, in terms of the signaling that's going on, you've got antithetical signals that are being produced from cardiovascular endurance exercise versus resistance exercise in terms of what pathways are being turned on. One is anabolic, the other one is substantially catabolic. So those are kind of two sides of the metabolic spectrum. So for someone who, for whatever genetic reasons, tends to be more, you'd see them as being more ectomorphic, they've got probably better genetics for endurance type of exercise, or maybe they don't have good genetics for any type of exercise adaptation, but putting on muscle mass is not their forte. Cardio is going to be something that's not going to help them gain size. They're not going to recover all that well from it, and it's not going to help them hold size when they're dieting down. So I wouldn't be surprised whatsoever if there's overlap between people who've noticed that and those who don't do all that well with metformin, because that AMPK being sort of the central regulatory enzyme complex that's there that unites those two scenarios. It makes total sense to me that, you know, someone who can't gain size doing cardio in the off season in their legs specifically is not going to do well trying to gain size if they're taking in shitloads of metformin, 1.5 grams of metformin a day, and they're eating at 300 calories above what they think their balance point is. They're just trying to inch their way up because they don't want to gain body fat. They may have to like literally put the pedal to the metal with as many things as they're willing to do in order to gain just a couple pounds of muscle mass over the long haul. So for someone with those genetics, maybe it could be an issue. Some people, they can do all the like 2 hours of cardio when they diet down and their legs are still full and big. They just got to make sure they get them carbs in, you know, before they step on stage. And those people typically have really good genetics for muscle size anyway. So there's going to be a spectrum, I think.
Yep, absolutely.
And that's why you get different opinions. That's why you get different opinions on pretty much every drug, because of the variability there. It's like, you know, well, Bolinone didn't do that for me. I don't get any, you know, equipoise doesn't make me anxious. I just, you know, got big and hard and vascular. And I didn't feel toxed out at all. And my liver enzymes didn't change. And some people are like, I couldn't sleep. I was a wreck. I was like lashing out at people. It was worse than trend, you know? And so there's going to be so much variability. So that's the thing. It fits with this hormesis as well, is where you are on the curve will dictate whether or not using something like metformin or antioxidants or non-steroidal anti-inflammatories, things like curcumin, which would technically fall into that group, though it's not a drug per se, but it's, you know, basically being formulated as a drug with all the nano particular formulations and things that they're coming up with now to deliver the liver curcumin. You've got all this variability. So, but you're right. It's a violation of scientific external validity to take a situation where you've got an animal model. It's just, not to say it's not informative.
No, it's terribly interesting.
It's fascinating. And it can give you mechanisms from which you can look into other things that might be important.
Right.
Like what someone's, like if you look at, for instance, like we don't need to get to those, we have to pull them up even, but you know, the different phases of liver detoxification, phase 1, phase 2, sometimes it's phase 3 that people throw in there, but it's that phase 1 that in when it comes to gear is involving the CYP enzymes, the P450 enzymes, and there are polymorphisms there that are they're going to change the way in which people can handle different drugs and the amount of free radical stress that's imposed by those. And that may impact the extent to which someone experiences toxicity from one drug versus the other, how it impacts their digestion. People always wonder, like, you know, why you might feel crappy and lose your appetite from taking orals. It's like, well, your liver is an organ of your digestive system as well.
Yep.
In Chinese medicine, the liver is sort of the, it's a central point of health. If your liver and your GI is doing good, you're doing pretty good. We often forget that the liver is the source of systemic IGF-1, which is very representative of nutritional status. Burn victims, they're hurting, they're very catabolic, IGF-1 goes down. If your liver is healthy, you have lots of IGF-1 around. It's very much responsive to diet, not just growth hormone, to the somatomedin hypothesis. So you take someone who, for instance, just another extrapolation of what we talked about, who thinks, well, you know, orals they're pretty anabolic. You know, I can feel them. I feel strong. I feel aggressive in the gym. but I also feel kind of shitty. And that might be because your liver's getting stressed. And guess what? When your liver is stressed, you don't get a lot of IGF-1. And that is something that is, whether or not the IGF-1 that's released systemically from the liver has a direct impact on muscle growth, it certainly is representative overall anabolism in the body. Mm-hmm. So there's something there that's at least sort of indicated by the IGF-1 production in the liver. Mm-hmm. As to whether it's, you have to, like IGF-1 injected, you know, the LR3 form or what have you is going to be anabolic per se. That's a whole other topic. Yep. Some people find that the case, some people don't. Mm-hmm. Probably some genetics there too. So, but it's an external validity of saying, like, we found this study that, you know, in older folks that 70 grams of protein per day, what have you, that metformin impaired muscle growth, may or may not apply to you. Take it, think about it. When I did the podcast, I think you referred to that, and it was posted on the Advices Radio Facebook page. People were like, "Oh, okay, I'm taking my metformin out," and I'm like,
I guess that's the point I'm making. They heard you say that. I must have had 6 or 7 people going to me like, "What are you doing to me?"
Right? It's like no, and like there was even somebody who was commenting, like someone just posted, I think in the last 24 hours, like, I don't understand why people would do that, would even take metformin. I'm like, well, some people, they just have adverse effects to some of the other things they're using, whereas it makes sense in the context of their health parameters and how they prioritize health versus growth, that metformin is worth the trade-off, whatever it might be, even to, you know, because they have a family history. Like, your family history of diabetes, I think is the number one predictor of future diabetes, believe it or not. Yeah. You know, so if someone has a family history of diabetes and they think they need to do everything possible to prevent that, even in family members who have been active and even exercised formally, it would make sense in my mind to say, you know, I can see where they would want to, like, use the metformin as a preventative measure in their cases. So it's all contextual. It's all about the individual, but people will want to take things. It's easier to take things and look at them in a black and white sense. And that's, unfortunately, literally you see that in the abstract. It's the nature of what you see as far as conclusions in science is, and people don't glean the subtlety of this, but it's like a lot of times our findings suggest that, or this study indicates that, blah, 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 metformin can impair, or metformin impairs muscle growth. And the important part is that was this study, with all of the restrictions of the study, all of the limitations of this study. And those limitations may mean that the relevance to you reading that is like, nope, you're not a rat. You know, you're not using those doses transferred into a human dose that they gave the rats. You're not a cell in culture. You may not have the genetic polymorphism where that may be an issue for you, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. There's so many things that you don't have to really be a scientist per se, I think, to be able to know those things. And I've been lucky enough that I've been able to go to school and learn from some really brilliant people who can tear that stuff down really well. Scientists get caught up in this. It's human nature, I think. And I used to see, like, my 2 mentors in graduate school, like, there was one, this is just a side story, but there was a guy who came when they first started figuring out that GLUT4 transporters move around in the cell in response to exercise and insulin. Like, there's different pools of them, and like those are involved bringing glucose in and out of muscle cells.
And metformin, by the way, just really watching.
Yeah, of course, right, exactly, like all sorts of things. And he was describing, like, there was the information they had was that it started here and it went to there, and like all this really cool data with, you know, it's very, you can get lost in the sea of details. And my advisor, like, this was the world's foremost expert on this. I don't even remember the names of these people. It's just one of my first graduate level experiences. And I'm like trying to follow all these details, you know, and I didn't have the biology background really to like make sense of it all, but I'm trying to like keep them all in my head. And it's kind of confusing, but it's kind of making sense. And my advisor, who's been doing this for, you know, 40 years, he's like, so how do the GLUT transporters move? How do they get from point A to point B? And the world's foremost expert, he had no answer. He was he was baffled by that obvious question. So the obvious question you could say is, and some people go too far, is like, does this apply to me? And some people say, well, none of that applies to me because they're all beginners and it's all rats and there's no one studying like advanced bodybuilders doing what we do. It's like, well, some of it it's information that can inform you, that you can contextualize on your own, depending on how you choose to. Don't throw the baby out with the bathwater, but also realize that you're not a baby and maybe you like to take showers. So there's a soundbite for you if you want, you know, you're still getting wet. You're still using soap. You know, so there is some applicability there, even though you're not an infant in the bath. You're an adult in the shower.
So
that's the important point, I think.
That's right. The hard solid, I guess, where I was coming from this. Absolutely fascinating studies, but I think people somehow grab onto these things and take things away from them that the study doesn't actually that's not what the study is actually saying. You know? The study is the study, you know, and it's very interesting, and we can glean things from things, and we can learn things, and there's threads that we can pull on, and maybe the next study will give us further insight into the thing. But you know, a study like that doesn't say to me, look, someone that has made the choice to use 500 milligrams of metformin that has to stop tomorrow. That's that's going to impair their success, as it were. So. Okay.
I think the thing you can do too is literally take that information and I wrote an article on this many moons ago. I think it's on my website. It's for muscular development, but it's the idea that you can test these things out on yourself by taking one thing out and removing it, even if it's just with that example I gave of looking at muscle soreness. It's not the end all be all, but there's some common sense there to that. You can see what happens to body water, to soreness, to strength gains on a given muscle mass, a given muscle or a given exercise that you're doing, and literally go from one end of the spectrum, of course, within reason. Like what happens if let's say it's boldenone and someone's just using large amounts of gear anyway. They'll be like, you know what? Okay, so my total dose is 1 gram and it's made up of and I got 300 milligrams of boldenone. Like what happens if I take 300 milligrams from my other gear and I replace that with boldenone? So boldenone now goes from 30% to 60% of what I'm using. And what do I notice on my sleep, on my anxiety? What happens to my hematocrit when I allow that to happen for 8 weeks? So I give time for red blood cells to go up, et cetera, et cetera. Those things can be done. And I know of people that have done those things, and I've done those sorts of things myself where you just make the change. As isolated as you can, and then like you said, like it's a dead end, but at least you're like you're not peering down that and saying, well, some study says there's a dragon down at the end of that hallway. I'm not going down there. If you walk down it, there's no dragon, there's no boogeyman, there's no one to get you.
Go and have a look.
The metformin works great for me. Like what happened is my blood glucose went out of control, and I got softer, and I started gaining body fat. And I didn't have any reduction in the rate of gains of muscle mass or strength that I could tell. That's a pretty good trade-off for that person. So
I just wanted to get your opinion, like, because we're coming up on an hour and a half. I think some of these points that we talked about are relatively easy for us to kind of like, okay, so I can see that metformin is like, try it and see. You're like, if you don't see the response that you want from a benefits point of view and a cost point of view, it's fairly easy to make a decision. The most complicated one for me is the discussion about antioxidants, perhaps because there are so many different antioxidants. Yeah.
Right.
And so the question for me, my general recommendation to people is look, I think that if you're going to pursue this lifestyle and you intend to do it for a long time, you need to be honest and say, look, we're creating, very plausibly higher levels of oxidative stress than Citizen Joe is exposing himself to through the food we eat, the training practices we intake, engage in the drugs that we use, and so at the very least, I think that you should be trying to consume a diet rich in fruits and vegetables. Let nature do the job that it's evolved to do. Yeah, I have to be honest. I find it difficult to get people to do that. I really do. So I find myself then, trying to make a recommendation about an antioxidant position that says, look, start with a diet rich in fruits and vegetables. Guys really struggle with that. So then you kind of go, okay, so if you were in that position, there's a number of antioxidants that are in common use. You mentioned a number of, NAC and these types of things. I'm curious about two things here. One is your opinion of melatonin as an antioxidant.
Powerful, yeah.
As well as I believe it to be the most powerful antioxidant we have on a molecular weight basis. Its point of origin, it's involved in many functions of the human body today, including sleep, circadian rhythm management. But its actual origin point is it is fundamentally an antioxidant before it is anything else. And I've been experimenting with raising my melatonin levels through a number of different mechanisms, through the use of melatonin itself and obviously precursors and things like that. Do you have an opinion about, so if you were going to use an antioxidant, if you had to put something on the table, could you make a recommendation or some guidance about which one you would choose and why?
But I want to toss one thing out that before I go to that question, and that's one of the things I think with fruits and vegetables, and I've fallen prey to this too, because it's never been something, as a kid I never seemed to like them, is that I think, at least in the States here, you may have it better over there, a lot of the fruits and vegetables, they just don't taste good because things are always changing, but they just, the nature of the soil being depleted of minerals, perhaps the pesticides they may have been sprayed with and then unsprayed with, they just don't taste that good. And so that could be part of it. And also, we take in so many artificial sweeteners. There's so many things that sort of, I think, can really kind of screw with our sense of taste and our body's ability to sort of sense what's maybe good and tasty for us. It's funny when everyone knows this who's dieted down, and I've heard some guys on the Fouad Abiad podcast, a lot of the guys everyone's dieting, so they're talking about all this food. It's half the podcast is about food. And they're thinking this is the greatest thing ever. When the diet's over, I'm going to be eating this all the time. But then when they go off the diet, they don't eat those things anymore because their choices of what, is good and delicious changes. And some of that is because our food supply is so tainted with so many chemicals, which have untold effects on, one, they're toxins in many ways, but they also change the way we taste things. And I think a lot of people and I've done this when I was, I did a primarily raw food diet for 2 years at one point in time when I lived back in Arizona. Literally, I was eating meat that I got straight from the farmer that was raw beef. We go and just go pick our fruits and vegetables at the farm, literally go out in the field and pick them ourselves like a farmer would. I'm far from being a farmer, but stuff was so delicious. It was beyond organic, basically. And the person that I owned this business with was very much into that. And she would do this with her clients, and I would with mine, is kind of do a clean out of your body, eliminate all the artificial sweeteners and all the stuff that is on the inner portion of the grocery store, stay on the outside, so to speak, which is where all the fruits and vegetables are found for sure. And the meats and the unprocessed foods are. And when you do that, and then you shift to things that are organic, or maybe that you're even getting, go down to maybe someone in your neighborhood who sells eggs or their own vegetables is not, maybe they don't follow, but you trust them, they're just selling it from the way you would from someone in a village who's, you give them one thing and then they give you fruits and vegetables. That stuff starts to taste good. We should, if you think about it, why in the world would, when vitamins and minerals are things our bodies can't produce, they're essential. They're the quintessence of essential nutrients. Why would things that are the richest sources we know for those things not taste good to us? That runs counter to nature. So I talk about weight training being an unnatural act. You're picking things up and putting them down, and you're just repeatedly doing that. Where are you trying to go with this thing? You're hacking into your system to evoke a muscular callus because it's cool, and we like to look good, and sexual attraction. We have our endeavors that make us bodybuilders for whatever psychological reasons we have. So that's an unnatural act. A lot of this is it's hacking into our biology, and we need to be friends with our biology as well. And one way to do that is to figure out how it is and why it is that we don't like the taste of fruits and vegetables.
Mm.
You really should. Not that you're going to like all of them necessarily, and people have allergies and all sorts of things, and that's a other topic. But I think finding a way to figure out why those things would taste good or would and should taste good for you, and find the ones you like, is a really good idea. Because then you don't have this juggling act of like, so how am I going to supplement in a way that sort of interacts with nature? It's sort of like you want to like grow plants in your garden, and like, so you go down to the hardware store to find a soil substitute, and it's like, why don't you just go someplace where there's rich, good soil and just use that, as opposed to buying something from Monsanto that's supposed to do, you know, all the things that regular soil would. It's a great example from nature is breast milk.
Yep.
You know, breast milk is just, it's like the perfect nutrient. And for so long, we're like, oh no, science, we can do it better than Mother Nature, you know, and assuming that the mother's got good nutrient intake. The breast milk is just phenomenal for babies' growth and their development and prevention of diseases, so many things. But, you know, the formula doesn't work, and there's various reasons for that. So I think the same sort of thing applies to fruits and vegetables.
Mm-hmm.
So anyway, that's a kind of a thought. Like, I would try that first, you know, and then if you need to like if you had to pick one, it's funny you said melatonin, because when it comes to recovery, sleep is numero uno by far. And when you sleep well, you get good melatonin output. So your body is producing that ideally. So I think, you know, if I had to like just put me on the spot, I'm thinking about this from a standpoint. If you're someone who finds that supplementing with melatonin helps get you to sleep, for instance, like a time-released formulation, so that you get all the other things that happen during sleep in terms of your brain waves and thymosin release and those various things that can help with recovery, growth hormone release, all that good stuff, then probably melatonin, because it is an antioxidant. And then it also, if it works well for you to help you sleep so that your body can undergo its own reparative processes, then melatonin, you know, that's a double whammy right there. It works in and of itself, as well as helps your body work with itself. So I think that's a good thing. So that would probably be it. But I think that for people who just don't want to go the fruits and vegetables route, like finding a veggie greens formula is not a bad one at all.
Okay. Yep.
And there's the timing issues we didn't even talk about. One thing to think about, although like the time course of vitamin E and C in the blood, even N-acetylcysteine, I think has like about a 4-hour period where supplementation increases blood levels. So you want to get some of that free radical stress from your training, and it's hard to find supplemental sources that taken at least in large amounts aren't going to overlap and blunt that free radical stress. The
training window, yeah.
Yeah, so it's like the timing, but ideally if you could separate the training with the time, with any use of those that you might, and this is a question I thought we might get to, maybe another podcast, with the use of those free radical quenchers, those antioxidants, because you're wanting to target what's going on in the liver, for instance, with a liver formula, taking those that's sometimes spaced away from your training might make sense, so that you can evoke or at least set in motion those free radicals stimulated adaptive processes from the training bout, and then also maybe have the benefit of taking in a liver formula or some antioxidants to help deal with the stress that using orals or using steroids in general, or any other supplements you're using, might have in terms of free radical stress. So it's the way to sort of kind of get your cake and eat it too, get your free radicals and quench them too. Ideally, but that's, you know, there's not enough data out there that I know of. That's just a hypothetical idea. I keep on seeing it mentioned in these articles, but I'm not seeing anyone look at it, you know, with the timing issue specifically. So it's a long answer to a shorter question.
As always, I could spend 3 hours talking to you. We are at 1.5 hours already. So I guess what I would like to do is, thank you for coming on. Can you just tell
Absolutely.
guys a little bit more about what you have on offer? You mentioned at the beginning of the podcast about your book, How to Be Your Own Bodybuilding Coach. I think that's the correct title. Yeah?
Be your own bodybuilding coach. Yep.
I myself have a copy of the book. I think it's a fabulous book. But can you just tell us a little bit more about where you can get that, and who it's really aimed at, and just give us a bit of a promotion of the Scott Stevenson offering, as it were.
Yeah, there's a video that I put together that made me want to buy the book when I finally watched it. Yeah, it's like it's kind of a brain dump. I like I've got some compelling music, but the idea is that you could use that book. It's sort of I lumped everything that I could, like all the big basic bits and pieces. This notion is in the book about hormesis. That first figure was from something in the book that I've used in presentations. So you could use that as literally a guide from a year-round strategy, from going post-contest. I think is probably the most important for lots of people. A lot of times you do a show and then you rebound and then everything goes to shit. Yeah. For a lot of people, isn't good. Like that can be the most critical, especially as far as health goes, to be sort of return to normalcy. So you can go from that post-contest to an off-season to a pre-contest, sort of a year-round cycle, which is what most people tend to do anyway because we're seasonal, the nature of Mother Earth. So I've got basically a way that you can sort of take that annual path in the course of the book, with all the bells and whistles that someone who's a competitor want to do, like your tanning, your presentation, how to monitor gains in fat-free mass or muscle mass relative to body composition, those sorts of things. All the big questions, literally almost everything I could think of. It took me over 3 years to write the book. There's a bunch of frequently asked questions, but it's also kind of just a reference guide for people. So if you want to know, like, tell me about omega-3 fatty acids, you can go to the index and find the pages where I refer to that. It's in the hardcover, which you can get on Amazon. A lot of people like that hardcover, I'm finding. I will probably just do hardcovers because the ebooks just end up getting stolen. People
I agree.
It's like, people are selling it like one got loose and now it's for sale all over the place. Hardly anyone buys the ebook from me, although you can get it on Amazon as a Kindle, but the formatting, I don't like Kindle formatting much. But the advantage to the ebook is that I've hyperlinked the bejesus out of it. So if you are reading along and you're on a section on fats and I mentioned omega-3s, you can click on omega-3s. And then if it says something about being anti-inflammatory in nature and that's a hyperlink, you can click on that and it might take you to where I talk about non-steroidal anti-inflammatory. So it's woven, the number of rabbit holes woven into the PDF to allow you to dig out topics, as well as take you to, there's like 2,400 references at the end of the book. So people can, if they're not clickable links, they're in the PDF, you can just type out the name of those studies and then you can go down the research rabbit holes as well. So if you want a topic, chances are I covered it or something about it related to it very closely in the book if it ever occurred to me. So it's there. So you can use it just like, I wonder what Scott has to say about CBD or metabolic slowing or whatever it might be. Or it's like, I need to figure out how to do my diet. I'm going to have to read what Scott has to say about macronutrients. I have a nutritional hierarchy in there that sort of helps you prioritize things. So it's from everything, but for like the cursory quick look, like let's dig into Scott's brain I'm going to try to use Scott as my Sherpa as I climb the top of Mount Everest. And and I've had people do that, which has been the most rewarding thing, is for people to come to me after they've gone through like an entire year, an off season, and done a show and been successful and relished and gotten the rewards of doing it on their own, essentially, but use my book as their guide. And they came to tell me and thank me for it, because that's just an honor that someone would trust in me that much. And then it's just phenomenal to see people just the glow, at least it comes through the messages when they've done it on their own, because there's so much personal growth that comes from that is it's their own personal growth. It's their journey that they took. Which is, intrinsically special, I think, in a very, very unique way. So I've been able to help people like that all around the world, which has just been absolutely phenomenal to do.
Cool.
So,
awesome. Well, thank you so much for your time again. It's always
My pleasure.
thought-provoking. I myself need to go away and pull on some shreds after our conversation and have a think about a few different things. So thank you, Scott. Your input to the community is so valuable. We just appreciate your input, appreciate your time, and I will. Already, I'm going to bug you in a couple more months to get you back on to talk about something else.
I'll do it for sure, man. I love these.
I'll come back and bug you in another 2 or 3 months, and we'll get you back on the show, buddy. Thank you so much.
And your podcast has been great too. I really, I'm glad you're doing this. You're giving back as well. Like, we're doing the same kind of thing. We know how this has been so important for both of us in our lives, and to be able to give back so easily.
Yeah.
Just put up a podcast. It's a beautiful thing. So thank you for doing your part as well.
It's fulfilling to be able to give something back that's valued.
I absolutely agree.
Cool. Awesome. All right. Thank you very much, guys. Sawadee Kam.